It was Christmas Eve, and I had spent the last hour placing ornaments on the tree. I did it the same way every year, carefully one by one, as if each ornament held a memory, a story. The dim lights flickered like they always did, casting soft shadows over the walls, making the living room feel like something out of an old family photo album. My daughter Isabel was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone. I had just finished arranging the last few ornaments when she suddenly said it with a kind of casualness that only someone with no understanding of what they've just said could have. "You'll ruin the Christmas photo," she remarked, not looking up from her screen. I stood frozen, ornament in hand. The words hung in the air like an unexpected punch, a slap so jarring that my first instinct was to laugh. Surely she didn't mean it. Maybe it was a joke. She didn't look at me. Her eyes were glued to her phone, her fingers swiping absent-mindedly. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, the flickering of the lights, the only sound. My mind couldn't catch up with the sting of her words. "You'll ruin the Christmas photo," she had said, not, "I don't want to take the photo with you," but something colder, something more final. It was more than just a Christmas photo. It was the culmination of everything I had sacrificed for her, for this family. And yet it felt like she was telling me, without actually saying it, that I was no longer needed, no longer enough, that I had become a decoration, a thing to be placed in the background of their perfect family image, but not a part of it anymore, a side note, something to be edited out when the time came. I didn't know how to respond. In that moment, I wished I could disappear, maybe even wish myself away. It would be easier than facing the truth of what I had just heard. I walked out of the room without a word, placing the ornament in the box I had pulled out earlier. My heart was too heavy to hold it together anymore. My mind raced with 1,000 thoughts I couldn't process. How had we gotten here? And for the first time in years, I was forced to confront a simple, terrifying truth. I was no longer needed, not in the way I had imagined, not in the way I had hoped for. The sound of Isabel's laughter drifted in from the living room, far too light, far too carefree. She was laughing at something on her phone, and it was all so effortless for her, as if she didn't care what she had just said. I wanted to scream. I wanted to shake her demand, an explanation, to ask her why. Why had she pulled away from me? Why had she turned into someone I didn't even recognize anymore? But I couldn't, because I had already given everything. I had spent years shaping myself into someone who could always be there for her, her protector, her guide. I had put my own dreams on hold for her, for this family. The career that I had once dreamed of, the aspirations that I once cherished, all of it had slowly been replaced by late-night feedings, homework sessions, endless hours spent teaching her right from wrong, guiding her through the maze of her growing up. And it was always me giving, always me sacrificing. I had become the parent who did it all, and in return, I had built this idea of what our family was supposed to be, a picture-perfect family with love radiating from every corner. But love doesn't always work like that, does it? I thought back to the sacrifices, the nights I spent lying awake in bed, unable to sleep because she was sick or upset. The hours I spent driving her to extracurricular activities, the money I spent to make sure she had everything she needed, even when I didn't. I had given up friends' opportunities, pieces of myself that I would never get back. But where had it all gone? Where was the daughter I once knew, the one who would cuddle up to me after a long day, the one who would laugh at the silliest things, the one who seemed to look up to me as someone worth loving. I didn't recognize the person in front of me now, and it hurt. But it wasn't just her. It was me too. I had let it happen. I had allowed myself to fade into the background, to become something disposable, something that could be pushed aside when it became inconvenient. I had let myself become someone she could criticize without even thinking twice. In that moment, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to admit before. I had been living a lie that I was enough, a lie that if I just kept giving, if I just kept showing up, things would be okay. But I wasn't enough, not anymore. And that was the hardest pill to swallow. The Christmas photo no longer mattered. What mattered was that I had been invisible for far too long. I had given my all, and for what? To be told that I would ruin the one thing that still felt like it could be beautiful. I was tired. Tired of pretending. Tired of giving everything only to be told, without saying it directly, that I was no longer a part of their perfect picture. I couldn't be a part of that anymore. I looked at the ornament in my hand. For the first time, it felt heavy, a symbol of all the years I had tried to hold everything together. But it was broken now, and there was no turning back. I often find myself thinking back to the early days, to the years before Isabel's words had cut through me like a knife. Back then, I had a different vision of who I was, who we were. I thought motherhood would be a story written with love, laughter, and endless connection, a story where I would always be there, not just physically, but emotionally guiding her through every step of life. And in the beginning, it was just that. She was my little girl. The way she would reach for my hand, the way her face would light up when I entered the room, I thought those moments would last forever. But time has a way of slipping through your fingers, and before I knew it, I had lost hold of the girl I once knew. The girl who at one point couldn't bear to be more than a few feet away from me. It wasn't always this way. I remember the day Isabel was born. The hospital room was small, but it was filled with light, a soft golden kind of light. It was the kind of light that made everything feel like it was exactly as it should be. I held her in my arms, this tiny, helpless being that I was going to protect with every fiber of my being. I remember the way she looked at me, those wide, trusting eyes, as if I were her entire world. In those first few months, it was just the two of us. There was no one else to lean on, no one else to share the burden of sleepless nights and endless feedings. It was a lonely, beautiful time, but I reveled in it. I had never been more sure of anything in my life. I gave up my job, my friends, my life, outside of our little home, because I believed this was what motherhood was supposed to be, pure, undivided devotion. I gave up a career I had worked so hard to build. I had dreams of traveling, of being successful, of making something of myself. But when she was born, all of that seemed so far away, so unnecessary. But I didn't mind. I was her mother. I was her everything. At first it felt natural, even rewarding, to put my own desires on hold. I didn't need anyone else. I had Isabel. I would read her stories, hum lullabies, and soothe her to sleep when she had bad dreams. I was everything she needed, and in that I found a kind of fulfillment I had never experienced before. But then came the quiet changes. They were subtle at first, the way she started to look past me, as if I were no longer the center of her world. I began to feel it when she was a toddler, the moments where she would look for her father instead of me, the way she started asking him for things when she used to ask me. At first, it was easy to brush off. It was just a phase, right? Just a small passing moment in the long winding road of parenthood. But those moments started to become more frequent. I felt her slipping away in the small ways, the forgotten thank yous, the unspoken criticism, the distant gaze. And slowly, ever so slowly, I began to realize I wasn't the woman I used to be. The woman who could chase her dreams, the woman who stood proudly in her career, the woman who was known for something other than being a mother. I had disappeared, and in the process, so had she. I can't even pinpoint when exactly I stopped being enough. I only know that it was gradual, like a river eroding its banks, until one day there was nothing left but a wide, gaping space, the space between us, a space I couldn't bridge no matter how hard I tried. It wasn't just Isabel, it was the whole family, my husband too. Over the years, I had become accustomed to his tired smile, the way he would glance at me before retreating into his own world. I thought I understood. I told myself it was just life, just the pressures of work and family. But now I wonder if I had been too caught up in my own sacrifice to see what was happening to us. I remember the moments where we used to sit together, quietly, talking about our hopes, our fears, our plans for the future. But those moments had stopped. We had both become too busy, too distracted by the demands of life, by the things that didn't matter in the grand scheme of things. The quiet erosion of connection, like sand slipping through an hourglass, had caught up with us both. Isabel had become a stranger to me. She was no longer the child who reached for my hand. She had grown into a young woman, someone whose thoughts I couldn't reach, no matter how hard I tried. There were days when I would watch her wondering who she had become. It was as if she were a completely different person, someone I didn't recognize, someone who had already moved on to a life without me. And yet I kept trying. I kept holding on to the hope that somehow, if I gave enough, loved enough, I could bring back the connection we once had. I kept trying to convince myself that there was still time, that I could fix it. But somewhere along the way, I stopped asking myself if I should be fixing it. And instead, I started asking, why am I the only one trying? The realization was like a slap in the face. And that was the moment when I started to wonder if I had been so focused on what I had lost that I had forgotten what I was supposed to be finding. Was I giving to the point of losing myself completely? Had I become a shadow of who I once was, all in the name of motherhood? Maybe I had. Maybe I hadn't given enough thought to what it meant to give so much of myself that I was left with nothing. And now, standing in the living room, listening to the Christmas music, playing softly in the background, I couldn't ignore it anymore. Isabel's words cut deeper than I ever thought they could not, because of what they said, but because of everything they didn't. The loss was already there, buried beneath layers of guilt, of sacrifice, of expectations I had created for myself. The realization that I had given up more than I ever should have was suffocating, but it was also a door opening, when I wasn't sure I was ready to walk through. But I would, because that was the only way forward. The truth was hard to swallow, harder than any pill I had ever taken. It wasn't just about Isabel's words, as much as they stung. They were the symptom, not the cause. The cause was much deeper, and it had been growing for years without me noticing. It was the slow, subtle death of a connection that once felt unbreakable. The quiet betrayal of myself, of the woman I used to be long before I became her mother. It wasn't like I didn't love her anymore or that I didn't want to fight for her. I did. I fought for her every single day of her life, for the person I hoped she would become, for the moments when she would look up at me and smile with that same trusting innocence she once had. But I didn't know how to fight anymore. I didn't know where the lines between mother and person had blurred, or when my role as her protector and guide had swallowed every other part of me whole. I hadn't just let go of myself for her, I had disappeared for her. The day Isabel was born, I promised myself I would always be there. I promised that no matter what, I would never abandon her. But somewhere along the way, I realized that I had abandoned the person I was before her. I had abandoned the woman who had dreams and hopes and ambitions beyond motherhood. I had abandoned the woman who still wanted to be seen, heard, loved for more than the roles she played. I had let motherhood become my identity, but in doing so, I lost touch with the parts of me that made me feel alive. I thought I was doing the right thing. I told myself that I was being a good mother by sacrificing my own desires for her, that I was being selfless. But that selflessness had turned into something else. It had become a trap, a cage of my own making. I had convinced myself that as long as I gave more, did more, loved more, everything would work out. But I had forgotten the most important part. I couldn't pour from an empty cup. The moment Isabel's words hit me, I felt like I had been slapped out of a fog I hadn't even realized I was in. I realized, too late, that I had become invisible. I had molded myself so completely around the idea of being her mother that I had forgotten what it meant to be me. And now, here we were, a family in name, but so far apart emotionally that the distance felt impossible to bridge. What had happened? When had we stopped being a team, a family that shared everything I had sacrificed so much? And yet, it wasn't enough. Was it ever enough? I tried to retrace the steps. The moments, the small changes that had crept up on me, unnoticed at first. It started with the long hours I spent at home taking care of Isabel while her father worked late. Those were the days I thought I was building something, a stable home, a loving environment, a foundation for Isabel to grow. But with each passing year, it became clear that I was the only one building. I was the only one trying to hold it all together. Isabel grew older, more independent. I used to look forward to the days when she would come home from school, the way she would share her little victories and disappointments. But over time, those conversations became shorter, more distant. The spark in her eyes that once mirrored mine was fading, and I didn't know how to stop it. I wanted to blame her father. I wanted to blame everyone else for the growing divide between us. But the truth was, it was no one's fault but my own. I had spent so many years focusing on being the perfect mother that I had forgotten what it meant to be the perfect person, a person who deserves to be seen, heard, and respected, not just loved out of obligation. I didn't know how to change it, how to bridge the gap I had created. I had given everything, and yet it felt like nothing. The more I gave, the more I faded into the background. The more I loved, the more I became a shadow. The realization hit me like a tidal wave. I had been so busy being there for her, being everything she needed, that I had forgotten the one person I was supposed to be there for the most myself. It hurt. It hurt to admit it, but it was the truth. And admitting it was the first step toward fixing it, toward finding my way back to myself, toward reclaiming my own identity, the one I had sacrificed so willingly for the sake of family. It was in that moment, standing in the middle of the living room, the Christmas music playing faintly in the background, the ornaments on the tree glimmering under the soft light, that I knew I had to make a choice. I could continue to fade into the background, to give and give until I had nothing left. Or I could stand up for myself, reclaim the parts of me that had been lost, and begin to rebuild the relationship with Isabel, not as someone who was always giving, but as someone who deserved to be loved and valued in return. It wouldn't be easy. It would take time. And I wasn't even sure Isabel would ever understand. But I knew I couldn't keep living like this, hoping that one day things would magically fix themselves. I had to take control. For me, I didn't know how to tell her that I was hurt. How could I explain that I had spent years feeling invisible, that I had sacrificed everything only to be told I would ruin a photo? How could I make her understand that I wasn't just her mother? I was a person, someone with feelings, someone who needed love, too. The truth was, I didn't know if I could, but for the first time in years, I didn't need her to understand. I didn't need anyone to understand. I just needed to take the first step toward finding myself again, even if it meant walking away from the person I had been in the process. And that's when I made the decision. I was done being invisible. The hardest part, I realized, wasn't deciding to change. It was coming to terms with the fact that I had been the one holding the key to my own prison all along. For so many years, I had convinced myself that the sacrifices I was making were noble, that they were necessary for my family. But what good is nobility when it leaves you hollow? What's the point of protecting everyone else only to lose the person you need to protect the most yourself? The decision wasn't easy, and even as I made it, I felt the weight of doubt pressing down on me. Would Isabel ever forgive me for the mother I had become? Would she ever understand why I had to reclaim who I was, even if it meant taking a step back from the role I had so willingly worn for years? And what about my husband? What would he think of the woman who had put herself last for so long, only to finally realize she had disappeared in the process? I didn't know. I didn't have answers, and in that moment, the lack of certainty was terrifying. But I knew one thing: if I stayed where I was trapped in this suffocating cycle of self-sacrifice, I would only grow bitter, and bitterness wasn't going to help anyone. Not me, not Isabel, not anyone. I had to let go of the past, of all the expectations I had put on myself, and allow myself the space to rebuild. It started with the simplest of things. I stopped waiting for Isabel to come to me, to reach out with the same tenderness she once had. I stopped bending over backward to prove that I was still worthy of her love. Instead, I started focusing on me. I picked up old hobbies I had abandoned, the ones I had pushed aside for so long. I dusted off my old notebooks and began writing again. I signed up for a yoga class, something I had always wanted to do, but never felt like I had the time for. Slowly, I began to remember what it felt like to exist outside of the identity of being a mother. At first, it felt selfish. Every hour I spent doing something for myself felt like an hour I should have been spending on my family. But as time went on, I began to understand that this wasn't selfishness. It was self-care. And in order to be a good mother, a good wife, a good person, I had to be able to give from a place of strength, not depletion. I needed to remember who I was outside of my role in their lives. But as much as I tried to reclaim my own life, the truth of the situation hit me with an unexpected force. Isabel, the girl who had once been so close to me, who had once turned to me for everything, was now a stranger in my house. She no longer shared her thoughts or feelings with me the way she once had. Every attempt I made to bridge the gap between us felt like I was speaking a different language. She was withdrawn, almost as if she were trying to protect herself from me, and that hurt in a way I hadn't prepared for. One evening, a few weeks after I began to focus on myself, I was sitting at the kitchen table, my journal in front of me, writing about the change I was trying to embrace. Isabel came in, and for a moment, I thought she might say something. She lingered by the door, looking at me but didn't speak. The silence stretched between us, and I could feel the years of emotional distance pressing down on both of us. It was as though everything I had been trying to do, everything I had been hoping for, had brought us no closer. Finally, she broke the silence. "You're really doing this, huh?" Her voice was flat-guarded. She wasn't angry, but she wasn't affectionate either. It was a statement, not a question. I closed my journal and looked at her, trying to read her face. "Doing what, sweetheart?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. "Becoming someone else." The words hung in the air heavy, like they had been waiting to be said for a long time. I wanted to defend myself, to explain that I wasn't becoming someone else, that I was just trying to find my way back to the person I used to be. But I didn't. Instead, I took a deep breath and said, "I'm trying to find myself again. I think I lost who I was for a while." Isabel didn't answer. She just nodded, then turned and walked out of the room. It was a small moment, a quiet exchange, but it was also a step forward, a crack in the wall that had built itself between us. I didn't know where that conversation would lead. I didn't know if Isabel would ever truly understand what I was doing, or if she would ever forgive me for taking the space I needed to heal. But for the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of hope. It wasn't much, but it was something. The hardest part of this journey wasn't the sacrifices I had made, or the realization that I had given too much of myself. It was understanding that I had no control over how others would react to the changes I was making. I couldn't force Isabel to understand. I couldn't force anyone to see the woman I was becoming. All I could do was take the steps toward healing for myself, to start living a life that was no longer defined solely by my role as a mother, a wife, a caregiver. As I stood there in the quiet aftermath of our exchange, I realized that this was my turning point. No, things weren't perfect. They weren't even close. But the first step toward reclaiming my life was understanding that I had the right to change, that I had the right to be more than just a mother. And if Isabel could see that, if she could understand that I was doing this not out of selfishness, but out of a desperate need to reconnect with myself, maybe, just maybe, she would find her way back to me too. But if she didn't, I would still be okay, because I was no longer invisible. A few weeks had passed since that evening, and though Isabel hadn't said much since our brief exchange, there was a change in the air, a subtle shift that was hard to pin down but unmistakable. It was like the calm before the storm, or maybe the storm had already passed, and now the dust was beginning to settle. I didn't know what to expect, but I knew I couldn't keep waiting for things to happen. If I was going to rebuild anything, it had to come from within me first. I had found peace in my own small victories, reclaiming the parts of myself that had been lost, embracing the things that brought me joy. Writing, painting yoga, and even just sitting quietly in the mornings with my coffee, watching the sun rise through the kitchen window. It wasn't about doing everything perfectly. It was about giving myself the permission to be, permission to exist outside the roles that had consumed me for so long. And while it didn't fix everything, it gave me something no one could take away: my own sense of self-worth. And yet, despite all of my efforts to focus on me, the ache of our distance still lingered. I missed my daughter. I missed the way she used to light up when she saw me. I missed the deep conversations we used to have, the shared silences that spoke louder than any words. The young woman who stood before me now was someone I didn't fully understand, someone whose thoughts were her own, guarded and hidden. I longed for the closeness we had once shared, but I knew now that I couldn't force it. If it was going to come back, it had to be on her terms, in her time. One evening, about a month after our conversation in the kitchen, Isabel came home later than usual. I was in the living room reading a book when I heard her footsteps in the hallway. She didn't say anything at first. She never did when she came home late. But tonight, something was different. There was a hesitation in her step, like she was gathering the courage to say something, but wasn't sure if she should. I put the book down, not wanting to startle her. "You okay?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. She stood in the doorway, looking down at her feet. "Yeah, just tired." She paused for a moment, and then, without looking up, added, "I've been thinking about what you said." My heart skipped a beat. I didn't know what she meant, whether it was about me reclaiming my own life or something else entirely. But I held my breath, waiting. I didn't get it before she continued, her voice softer than usual. "I thought you were being selfish, but now I kind of see why you had to do it, why you needed to. I guess I just didn't understand what it was like for you. You were always there for me, and I never really thought about what you needed." I could feel my chest tighten as the weight of her words sank in. For a moment, I couldn't speak. There was so much I wanted to say, so much I wanted to explain, but I held back. This wasn't the time for a speech. This was a moment of connection, however small it may have been, and I didn't want to ruin it. Instead, I nodded slowly, a small smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. "I'm glad you understand, sweetheart. It wasn't about you. It was about me remembering who I am and what I need too. I think we both needed to find our way again." Isabel shifted, still looking down. "I miss when it was just the two of us," she said quietly, her voice almost a whisper. "When you were just you, not just my mom." The words hit me like a wave, and I found myself holding back tears. I hadn't realized how badly I had been craving this, not just her understanding, but her acknowledgement that the person I had once been was worth remembering. I missed that too. I whispered, a lump forming in my throat. But I'm here, and I'm still me, just a little different now. She looked up, then her eyes searching mine. For a brief moment, I saw a glimpse of the little girl who once trusted me with all of her heart. And in that moment, I knew that no matter how long it took, we would find our way back to each other. Isabel took a deep breath. "I don't know how things are going to be between us," she said, "but I think I want to try. I want to try to understand you more. I think we can figure this out together." I wanted to reach out, to pull her into an embrace, to tell her that everything would be okay. but I knew that the road ahead would be slow and winding. We had a long way to go before we could get back to the kind of relationship we once had, and maybe it would never be exactly the same. But the hope, the flicker of possibility, was enough for now. Enough to make me believe that we could rebuild what had been lost. I'd like that, I said softly. I'd like that very much. The next few days were filled with small moments that didn't erase the distance, but slowly began to close the gap. Isabel still spent much of her time with her friends, and I still spent mine working on the things that brought me peace. But there were more conversations, more shared silences, more attempts at understanding. I stopped expecting instant change and began accepting the pace at which we both needed to heal. And as the days passed, I began to realize something that had been nagging at me since the very beginning. I wasn't trying to fix our relationship because I wanted things to go back to the way they were. I was trying to fix it because I wanted us to grow together, to allow each other the space to change, to evolve, and to find new ways to love and support one another. It wasn't about perfection. It was about connection. It was about the kind of love that endures even when it has been tested, even when it has been cracked and bent and broken. Because love, when it is real, doesn't fade. It just finds a new way to breathe. And that was what I was learning, to breathe again. A month passed, and the subtle shifts in our relationship were becoming more apparent. Isabel and I were no longer two strangers under the same roof, walking around each other like ghosts of a past that didn't quite fit. We were starting to navigate our way back toward each other, cautiously, tentatively, but still we were moving forward. It wasn't perfect, though. There were still moments when I could feel the invisible wall between us, the gap that had widened over the years, and no matter how much we tried to bridge it, there were things we couldn't undo. Some wounds were deeper than others. But now, when I looked at Isabel, I didn't see the distance I had seen before. I saw a young woman still figuring out who she was, still learning how to reconcile the changes she had gone through, and the relationship we were beginning to build again. And I saw myself, a woman who had rediscovered her strength, a mother who no longer felt invisible. One evening after dinner, Isabel and I found ourselves sitting on the couch together, neither of us speaking at first. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, though. It was different from before, when it felt like something was always simmering beneath the surface. Now the silence felt like space, for us to breathe, for us to be. I had learned something in this process, something I hadn't fully understood before. Healing isn't linear. It isn't about fixing everything all at once, or even fixing everything at all. It's about making room for change. It's about letting go of the expectation that things will be perfect and accepting that sometimes just being there is enough. Finally, Isabel broke the silence. Do you ever think about how things would have been different if you had stayed the same, if you hadn't changed? Her words caught me off guard. I hadn't expected her to ask, hadn't expected her to wonder about the woman I used to be. I had wondered the same thing countless times, but I had never vocalized it. I turned to face her, meeting her eyes for the first time in what felt like forever. I think about it a lot, I said, quietly. I think about how things might have been if I hadn't changed, if I hadn't let myself lose sight of who I was. But I also think about who I am now, and I can't regret that. Isabel looked down at her hands for a moment, twisting the edge of her sleeve. "I'm not saying it was bad that you changed," she said softly. I guess I didn't understand why you had to, why you couldn't still be the same person and also be my mom. I didn't realize how much you had given up for me for us." It was strange hearing her say that. I hadn't realized until that very moment just how much I had been carrying, how much of myself I had buried under the weight of my role. But hearing her voice, hearing her acknowledge the sacrifice, it made me realize something else. I had been so caught up in the idea that I had to do everything for everyone else that I had never stopped to ask for recognition for the woman I was, the woman who deserved to exist beyond the roles she had taken on. And here, sitting beside me, was Isabel, finally beginning to understand. I didn't want to change. I said my voice, barely a whisper. But I think I had to. I had to change in order to remember who I was, to remember that I am more than just a mom. I'm a person. And as much as I love you, as much as I love being your mom, I had to love myself too, or I wouldn't have had anything left to give. Isabel was quiet for a long time after that. I could see her processing my words, her mind racing. I didn't know what she was thinking, and I didn't press her. She would come to her own conclusions in her own time, but I could feel the shift in her, the subtle opening of her heart. For the first time in a long while, I felt like we were truly in this together. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about everything that had happened, everything I had learned. I had spent so much of my life trying to be what everyone needed me to be until I lost myself in the process. I had spent years trying to be the perfect mother, the perfect wife, the perfect everything. But perfection isn't real. And if I had learned anything in this journey, it was that striving for perfection only leads to emptiness. The real work was in allowing myself to be imperfect, to be flawed, to be human. The real work was in choosing to be true to myself, and in doing that, allowing others the space to be true to themselves too. I wasn't the perfect mother. I wasn't the perfect wife, and I didn't need to be. The next day, Isabel and I sat down together in the kitchen for the first time in what felt like ages. No expectations, no grand conversations about what had happened or how things were going to change. Just two people sharing a moment of peace. It wasn't a perfect moment, but it was enough. And that for the first time felt like everything. We didn't speak much, but as we sat there, I realized that the love between us wasn't about fixing anything. It was about letting go of the past, of the hurt of the expectations we had both carried, and allowing ourselves the space to just be. And in that moment, I understood. The journey wasn't about going back to the way things were. It was about moving forward together, two people who had changed, who had grown, but who had found each other again in the quiet, imperfect truth of who we had become. We were both still healing. We both still had a long way to go. But I no longer felt the need to fix everything. I no longer felt like I had to carry the weight of the world. And that in itself was a kind of redemption. The days continued to pass, and with each one, I began to feel the distance between Isabel and me shrinking just a little. It wasn't fast. It wasn't a grand transformation. There were still moments when the silence was heavy, when the old wounds flared up, and I'd catch myself wishing for a different reality. But in the small moments, the ones we didn't always plan, I saw the change. I saw us slowly rebuilding what had once felt like an unshakable bond. the kind of connection I had taken for granted when she was younger. One afternoon, as I was finishing up some work in the kitchen, Isabel came in, holding an envelope in her hands. I glanced up, surprised, to see her standing there, as if she had been carrying this envelope for some time, but hadn't quite known what to do with it. "Mom," she said softly, "I found this while cleaning out some old stuff." She handed me the envelope with a hesitant look on her face, unsure of what I would think. I took the envelope, turning it over in my hands. The handwriting on it was familiar, a past version of myself that I hadn't thought about in years. It was addressed to Isabel, written in my own hand. It was a letter I had written to her when she was just a little girl, filled with the kind of love and hope only a mother could express for her child. I could feel my heart tighten in my chest as I opened it. The words were as simple as they were profound. "You are my everything. No matter where life takes us, no matter how much you grow, you will always be my child. You will always be loved just as you are." I had written this letter before life got complicated, before I had started to lose myself in the maze of motherhood, and before I forgot to be more than just her mother. I felt a wave of emotion wash over me. It was a reminder of the woman I had once been, the woman who had given everything without hesitation, the mother who had believed that love could fix anything, that devotion could make everything right. And yet I couldn't help but wonder if I had forgotten that same love for myself. I looked up at Isabel, who was now standing silently beside me, her eyes searching my face. Her expression was unreadable, but there was a vulnerability there, something I hadn't seen in a long time. I didn't know if you would want to read it," she said, her voice softer than usual. "But I thought maybe it would help you remember something." The weight of her words lingered in the air. She wasn't just handing me a letter, she was handing me a piece of the past, a reminder of who we once were, of the unbroken bond between us that I had nearly lost. I folded the letter back carefully, and with a quiet exhale, I smiled at her. "Thank you," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "Thank you for bringing this to me. It's beautiful." Isabel's eyes softened, and she nodded, though she didn't speak. She had already said so much, just by sharing the letter with me. In that small, quiet moment, I felt something shift again. Not a dramatic change, but a shift, the beginning of a new understanding between us. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about the letter again, and I thought about how much had changed, how far we had come from the mother and daughter we used to be, but how, in so many ways, we were the same. Beneath the years of distance, beneath the hurt and the misunderstandings, we were still connected by the love I had written about in that letter. But that love had grown too. It wasn't just the love of a mother for her child. It was the love of two people, a mother and a daughter, who were learning how to be human together, how to live in a world where imperfections were the rule, not the exception. The truth was, we had both changed. Isabel was no longer the little girl who needed me for everything, and I was no longer the woman who defined herself entirely through her role as a mother. But somehow, in the middle of all that change, we had found a new kind of love, one that was still messy, still complicated, but still real. The next morning, as I sat at the kitchen table, Isabel came in, her hair still wet from the shower, and without saying a word, she sat down across from me. She didn't offer anything grand, no big confession or apology, but I didn't need that anymore. The change, the healing, had already begun in small ways, in the moments where we didn't force each other into roles, where we just allowed ourselves to exist side by side. I think I get it now, she said, looking up from the cereal bowl in front of her. I think I get what you were saying about not losing yourself. I smiled gently, my heart swelling. I'm glad you understand, I said quietly. I think I finally learned that I can't lose myself and still be there for you. I've got to be whole too. She nodded, her gaze softening, and for a moment I saw something flicker in her eyes, a hint of recognition, of understanding. It wasn't a big moment, but it was enough. Maybe we'll never go back to the way things were, she added, her voice thoughtful. But maybe we don't have to. Maybe this is okay. And for the first time in years, I felt the weight in my chest lift. It wasn't about going back to who we were. It wasn't about fixing everything. It was about accepting the present, accepting who we had become, and learning to love each other in this new, imperfect version of our relationship. We didn't need to be perfect. We just needed to keep showing up for each other in whatever way we could. And that was enough. The journey wasn't over. It would never be. But I had learned something important. There is no final destination in love, no perfect ending. There is only the space between two people, the space where they choose to meet, where they choose to connect, and where they choose to love, not because it's easy, but because it's worth it. And for the first time in a long while, I believed that it was worth it. All of it. The quiet moments between Isabel and me began to grow in significance. There were no grand gestures or deep emotional confessions every time we spoke. Instead, it was in the little things, the brief exchanges, the shared glances, the sudden bursts of laughter over nothing at all. These moments, once so fleeting, now felt more meaningful than I had ever imagined. I started to realize that the perfection I had longed for, the perfect mother-daughter relationship, the perfect family, was an illusion. There was no blueprint for how it was supposed to be. No set of instructions that promised everything would work out if I just followed the rules. The real truth was messier, more complicated, and infinitely more beautiful. One afternoon, a few weeks after the letter incident, Isabel came home from school looking unusually thoughtful. She sat at the kitchen table and stared at her phone for a while, scrolling absent-mindedly. But I could tell something was on her mind. I could feel the weight of her thoughts in the air, even though she wasn't saying a word. I didn't rush her. I had learned over the past months that sometimes the best way to connect with Isabel was to give her space, to not push. After a long silence, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I think I've been really hard on you, Mom. The words hit me in a way I wasn't expecting. They were simple, almost too simple for the depth of what she was saying. But they carried an honesty that made my heart ache. I met her gaze across the table, my own words caught in my throat. I know, and I'm sorry too. I don't want to make you feel like you have to be perfect or that I expect you to be someone you're not. I've been so caught up in my own guilt and trying to fix everything that I haven't always seen you, the person you are now. She didn't say anything for a moment, but I could see her processing it. Then, as if making a decision, she put her phone down and leaned forward. I'm sorry for the way I've been. I know you were just trying to do what's best for me, but I wasn't always fair to you. I made it harder than it needed to be. The softness in her voice, the way she looked at me now, was a stark contrast to the way we had been not too long ago. And though we still weren't perfect, neither of us in that moment, I felt a warmth spread through me that I hadn't felt in a long time. The ice had cracked, and we were both finally starting to breathe again. I couldn't help but smile, the weight of years of tension lifting just a little bit more. "It's okay," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "It's okay. I've made my mistakes too, and I think we're both just learning, you know." Isabel nodded slowly, as though she understood, really understood for the first time. "I think so." And in that moment, I knew that we were okay. Not perfect, not everything fixed, but we were real. And that, I realized, was more than enough. It wasn't the grand reunification I had once envisioned. There were no fireworks, no immediate resolution to all the hurt we had shared. But there was progress, and progress when it comes to healing is often quieter than we expect. It doesn't announce itself with loud declarations or dramatic gestures. It shows up in the small things, the way you can look at each other and feel seen, the way a single conversation can bridge years of distance. That evening, as we sat together on the couch, our comfortable silence returning, I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't experienced in years. It was in the way Isabel curled up beside me, resting her head on my shoulder like she had when she was a little girl. It was in the way we shared a quiet evening without the need to fill every moment with words. As I looked at her, I saw more than just my daughter. I saw a young woman who was finding her own way, carving out her own space in the world. And I was okay with that. I no longer felt the need to control her or her life. All I needed to do was to be there for her in whatever way she needed me to be. I also realized that the healing had to continue for both of us. Isabel was still finding her way, and I was still learning to stand on my own 2 feet, separate from my role as her mother. We were both works in progress. But now, more than ever, I understood that it was in the space between us, the quiet moments, the shared experiences, and the acceptance of each other's flaws, that our relationship would grow. It was not about fixing the past. It was about moving forward together. As the night wore on and we settled into our new rhythm, something shifted in me. The realization that we didn't need to be perfect hit me hard, but in the most beautiful way. I had spent so much of my life trying to be the perfect mother, the perfect wife, the perfect everything. But perfection isn't real, and I didn't need it. I had already done the hard work, the work of finding myself again, the work of loving myself enough to stop losing myself for the sake of others. And in doing that, I had found my way back to Isabel, not as the mother who had once defined herself solely through her role, but as the woman who had learned to balance her love for her child with her love for herself. And that, I realized, was the greatest gift I could give her. It wasn't a victory. It wasn't a moment of triumph. It was just life unfolding as it was meant to. Imperfect, messy, and full of love. I finally understood that the love I had longed for, the connection I had yearned for, was never about perfection. It was about the willingness to keep showing up, to keep loving, and to keep trying, even when it felt like everything was falling apart. Because in the end, love is not about fixing everything. It's about accepting each other as we are and choosing to be there for each other, even when it's hard, even when it's messy, even when it's not perfect. And for the first time in a long time, I was at peace with that. The weeks that followed were a quiet, steady kind of progress. Things weren't magical overnight, and there were moments where I could feel the past creeping in, the old patterns, the old wounds. But there was something different now, something more tangible than what we had before. It wasn't about fixing everything in one grand gesture. It was about creating a space where we could both be who we were, no longer defined by expectations, but by the truth of who we had become. I still didn't have all the answers. I still had moments of doubt, moments where I questioned whether I was doing enough or whether I was truly on the right path. But those moments were fewer and farther between. The inner peace I had worked so hard to find was starting to feel like a natural part of me, something I could carry with me even on the hardest days. One evening, as I sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, Isabel came out with a cup of tea in her hands. She was still wearing her school uniform, her bag slung over her shoulder, as if she had been rushing to get outside before the sun fully disappeared. She sat down beside me, not saying anything at first. There was something peaceful in the way she settled beside me, the way the space between us had softened. She didn't need to fill the silence with words anymore. It was enough just to be there. After a long pause, she turned to me and said, "I've been thinking a lot about the future." I raised an eyebrow, curious. Isabel rarely spoke about the future, at least not in the way she was now. Her thoughts had always been focused on the present, on the things that felt more immediate, school friends, the usual teenage concerns. "What do you mean?" I asked gently. She sipped her tea before answering, her gaze fixed on the horizon. I think I've been so focused on what I want to do, what I want to be, that I never really thought about how I'm going to get there. I've been so caught up in the idea of who I'm supposed to be that I didn't really think about who I actually am. The words hung in the air for a moment, a realization that seemed to surprise both of us. I could see the shift in her eyes, the vulnerability, the openness she had rarely allowed herself to show. I guess she continued. After a beat, I was always so focused on being perfect, on being who everyone wanted me to be. I never really stopped and asked myself what I wanted, who I really am. I could feel the weight of her words, the depth of her inner conflict. It reminded me so much of how I had once felt, how I had lost myself in the expectations of others, how I had pushed myself to the edge to please everyone around me. And like her, I had learned the hard way that perfection isn't the answer. It's the authenticity, the willingness to embrace who we are, flaws, and all that makes life meaningful. I get it, I said softly, my heart swelling with pride. I think I've been on that journey too. For a long time, I was so focused on making everyone else happy that I forgot about myself. I forgot what I needed, what I wanted. But the truth is, we don't find ourselves by trying to be perfect. We find ourselves by embracing our imperfections, by being real with who we are. She turned to look at me, her eyes serious but soft. I think I'm starting to understand that it's okay not to have it all figured out, and it's okay to change, to not be who everyone thinks you should be. I smiled, feeling a lump form in my throat. The moment was so simple, yet it felt monumental. Isabel wasn't asking for approval. She wasn't searching for validation. She was just beginning to give herself permission to be who she was, and that was everything. "I'm proud of you," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. "I'm so proud of the person you're becoming." We sat in silence for a while, each of us letting the moment settle into our hearts. The sun was nearly gone, the sky streaked with hues of purple and orange. It was the kind of evening that made everything feel still, like the world had paused for a moment to let us breathe. And as I sat beside Isabel, I realized that the work wasn't done. Not by a long shot. We both still had so much to learn, so much to unravel. But we were on the right path now. We had both stopped trying to be perfect, stopped holding on to the version of ourselves that we thought we were supposed to be. We were finally embracing the version of ourselves that was real, that was unpolished, and that was enough. There would be days when we still struggled, days when the old patterns resurfaced, and days when the weight of everything we had been through would feel unbearable. But I knew now that we had a foundation, one built not on expectations, but on acceptance. We had learned to accept each other, to accept ourselves, and in doing so, we had found the one thing that truly mattered: peace. As I looked at Isabel, I realized that no matter what came next, no matter how much we changed or how much we grew, we would always be there for each other, not because we were perfect, but because we were real, and that I knew was the greatest gift we could give ourselves. We finished our tea in comfortable silence, watching as the last light of the day faded into night. There was no need for words anymore. The understanding between us had settled deep into our bones, like a quiet promise that we were in this together. Whatever came next, we would face it as ourselves, imperfect but strong. And that was enough. The days continued to stretch out, each one a quiet affirmation that we were finally moving forward, not as the people we once were, but as the people we were becoming. There was no sudden sweeping change. There were no dramatic breakthroughs or emotional epiphanies. But in the small, quiet moments of our everyday lives, I felt a steady shift, a kind of peaceful rhythm settling between Isabel and me, where the love we shared wasn't something that needed to be fixed, but something we could simply be. It wasn't always easy. Some days felt like we were drifting, uncertain of the path ahead, unsure if we were heading in the right direction. But other days, there were moments of clarity, moments where I saw the spark of something more between us, something that went beyond the roles we had played for so long. It was the beginning of something new, not a perfect relationship, but a real one. And that was enough. One morning, as I was sipping my coffee and reading the paper, Isabel came into the kitchen, still in her pajamas, hair tangled and sleepy-eyed. She walked straight up to me, something in her hands. I looked up, surprised by her sudden urgency. "Mom," she said, her voice serious, "I need to talk to you." I set the paper down immediately, sensing that something was different. There was a shift in the air, a quiet tension that I hadn't felt in a long time. "Of course," I said, my heart beating a little faster. I set the mug down and gave her my full attention. She hesitated for a moment, her fingers nervously tracing the edge of a notebook she was holding. I've been thinking a lot about everything, about who I am, about where I want to go, and I think I need to make some changes." The weight of her words hung in the air. I could see the conflict in her eyes, the uncertainty of someone who wasn't sure if they were ready to take the first step into an unknown future. "What kind of changes?" I asked, gently, not wanting to push her, but needing to know what was on her mind. She looked down at the notebook, the edges of the pages curling slightly. "I don't want to follow someone else's path anymore," she said quietly. "I don't want to be who I think people want me to be. I want to figure out what I want, what I really want. I've spent so much time trying to live up to everyone else's expectations, but I don't know if that's who I really am. I don't think it is." I felt a sudden lump in my throat as I listened. She was speaking so honestly, so openly, about something I knew all too well: the weight of expectations, the pressure to live a life that wasn't your own, the fear of losing yourself in the process. I think I understand, I said, my voice thick with emotion. I think I understand more than you know. She met my gaze, then her eyes searching mine for something, for reassurance, for understanding, maybe even for forgiveness. And in that moment, I realized that we were on the same journey now. We had both learned to let go of the past, to stop trying to live up to some idealized version of ourselves. We had both begun the hard work of reclaiming who we were meant to be. I'm proud of you, I said softly, for being brave enough to admit that, for being brave enough to find your own path. You don't have to have it all figured out right now, but it's okay to start looking for what you want. She nodded slowly, a sense of relief washing over her face. Thanks, Mom. I don't know what it's going to look like, but I think it's time I stop trying to be perfect. I think it's time I just lived. The simple, powerful truth of her words struck me deeply. We had spent so many years trying to be something we weren't, trying to live up to some ideal of perfection. But we were finally starting to understand that perfection wasn't the goal. Being real, embracing who we were, flaws, and all that was the real challenge, and perhaps the real gift. I think that's the best thing you can do, I said, with a quiet smile, reaching out to gently touch her arm. Live, just live as you are. It's all we can do. We sat there for a moment in comfortable silence, the weight of the conversation settling between us like a promise that we would continue to grow, continue to change, but that we would always do it together, even if we were no longer the people we once were. As the days passed, I could see the change in Isabel. She was more confident, more grounded. There was a newfound clarity in her eyes, a sense of purpose that hadn't been there before. She was beginning to understand in her own way what I had learned in the years before, that we can't wait for life to hand us perfection. We have to create it ourselves in the way we live, the way we love, and the way we choose to be. I realized then that the work I had done, the space I had made for myself, had not only helped me heal, it had opened up a path for Isabel to begin her own journey of self-discovery. I had shown her that it was okay to change, to grow, and to let go of what wasn't serving us. And in doing so, we were both learning what it meant to truly live, to live with authenticity, to live without the burden of perfection, and to live in a way that honored who we were and who we were becoming. It wasn't easy, and it would never be perfect, but it was real, and that in the end was enough. We didn't need to go back to who we had been. We just needed to keep showing up for ourselves, for each other, and for the journey that was still unfolding. And in that quiet understanding, in that shared moment of clarity, I knew we were going to be okay. As the months passed, life began to feel different, more settled. Isabel and I still had our moments of confusion, of questioning where we fit in each other's lives, but they were becoming less frequent. Instead of seeing every moment as a battle, we were learning to navigate the space between us with patience and understanding. We weren't just mother and daughter anymore. We were two people each on our own journey, each figuring out what it meant to be real with each other. And there were still days when the silence between us felt heavy. But now, when the silence stretched between us, it didn't feel like a wall. It felt like room to breathe, room to be who we were, without the pressure of expectations or the need to fill every second with something to prove. One Saturday morning, Isabel and I found ourselves in the kitchen, both of us lost in our own worlds. I was chopping vegetables for salad, and she was scrolling through her phone, her face lit by the soft glow of the screen. I didn't try to push her into conversation. In the past, I might have felt the need to fill the space with words to make sure we were connecting in some way. But now I realize that simply being there in each other's presence was enough. After a few minutes, Isabel broke the silence. "I think I want to go to college," she said, her voice soft but firm. I paused, the knife still in my hand. "Oh," I said, my heart skipping a beat. "What made you decide that?" She shrugged her eyes, meeting mine for the first time that morning. "I think I finally understand what I want. I don't have all the answers, but I think I need to get out of here, to figure things out on my own." I set the knife down and walked over to her, standing beside her. I had always known she had the potential for so much. She was sharp, independent, and curious, but I hadn't expected this conversation to come so soon. There was a part of me that wasn't quite ready to let go, the part of me that wanted to keep her close to protect her from the world. But I had learned that this was the process of growth, not just hers, but mine, too. "That sounds like a big decision," I said, my voice steady, but full of emotion. "Are you sure?" She nodded, her gaze unwavering. "I think it's time. For me, I mean. Not just for school or to make people happy, but for me. I need to do this." I felt a swell of pride in my chest. For so long, I had tried to teach her that she had the right to make her own choices, to live for herself, not for anyone else. But hearing her speak those words I had hoped she would one day say, was a reminder of how far we had come. She wasn't just my daughter anymore. She was becoming her own person, carving her own path, finding her own way. And in doing so, she was becoming the person I had always known she could be. "You don't need to have it all figured out," I said softly, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. "But I'm proud of you, so proud." Isabel smiled, her expression softening. "Thanks, Mom. I think I finally started to listen to myself instead of everyone else." The weight of those words sank in, and I realized just how much we had both changed. A year ago, this conversation would have been impossible. We would have been wrapped in a tangle of unspoken expectations, fears, and guilt. But now, the conversation felt natural. It felt real. We were speaking as equals, not just mother and daughter, but two people who had found a way to be honest with each other. "I think you're ready," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "You always have been, and whatever you choose, wherever you go, I'll be here for you. Always." She nodded, a small but meaningful smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "I know, Mom." We stood there for a moment, not needing to say anything more. The weight of the past had been lifted, and the future, though uncertain, didn't feel as daunting as it once had. We were both learning how to step into our lives, not as roles we had to play, but as people we had the freedom to be. The days that followed felt quieter, more reflective. Isabel spent more time thinking about her future, and I spent more time thinking about my own. It was strange, this new dynamic we had created. No longer bound by the unspoken rules we had once lived by, we both felt the freedom to explore who we were becoming. In the months that followed, Isabel made plans for college, applied to schools, and started imagining a future for herself, one that was no longer tied to the expectations she had once felt so burdened by. She was learning what it meant to live for herself, to take ownership of her decisions, and to make choices that felt true to her. And though the thought of her leaving was bittersweet, I knew this was her journey. She had to walk it on her own. As for me, I began to focus more on the parts of myself I had lost along the way. I went back to school to finish the degree I had put on hold years ago, and I started to write more, not just for others, but for myself. I began to remember the things that had made me feel alive before motherhood took over my identity. I was no longer just a mother, just a wife. I was me. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. There were still moments of doubt, moments when I wondered if I had done enough or been enough. But in those moments, I reminded myself that I was still learning. We both were. And that was the point. It was in the imperfection, in the messy parts of life, that we found the beauty. The beauty of being real, of being true to ourselves, of not needing to be fixed or to be perfect, but to simply be. The road ahead was still uncertain, but that uncertainty no longer felt like a weight. It felt like freedom. And as I watched Isabel pack her things, preparing to leave for college, I knew that we were both ready. We were ready to face the world, as we were unafraid of the future, unafraid of the change, because we had learned the most important lesson of all. The journey isn't about the destination. It's about how we walk the path together. The day Isabel left for college came quietly like any other day, but with the weight of something monumental hanging in the air. I watched her pack the last of her things into the car, each item a small symbol of the new chapter she was about to begin. Her life was moving forward, and though I had prepared myself for this moment for years, it still hit me with a profound ache. The kind of ache that comes when you realize your child is no longer your child in the same way. She was growing into her own life, and I was standing on the edge of that change, unsure of how much of me would be left once she was gone. I had spent so many years thinking that my identity was tied to being her mother. And yet in this moment, I realized that my identity was still evolving. It wasn't just the mother I had been or the woman I had tried to become for Isabel's sake. It was the woman I was becoming for me. And that was the hardest part, the letting go. Are you sure you have everything I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, trying not to let my emotions show too much? Yeah, I'm sure, Isabel said with a soft, knowing smile. She wasn't the little girl I had once held so tightly to, but I still saw traces of her in the way she looked at me, the same trust, the same care. I'll be fine, Mom. You've taught me everything I need to know. Her words hit me like a wave, and for a moment, I couldn't speak. In that simple sentence, she had summed up everything, the years of love sacrifice and uncertainty. She had learned what she needed to learn, and now it was time for her to take her next steps. Time for her to walk her own path. I'm proud of you, I finally said, my voice thick. So proud. She hugged me tightly then, and I could feel the weight of her own emotions too. She wasn't just leaving for school, she was stepping into a new version of herself, one that didn't need me in the same way. I wanted to hold on to keep her close, but I knew, deep down, that this was the moment I had been preparing for, the moment I had to let go and allow her to become the person she was meant to be. As we pulled away from the driveway, Isabel's car driving off toward a future I couldn't control. I stood there for a long while, watching the dust settle in the wake of her departure. It was a strange emptiness, not one filled with sadness, but with the recognition that the next chapter was mine to write too. The space she had left behind wasn't just an absence. It was room for me, room to live my own life in a way that was no longer centered on her, but on me. That afternoon, I sat in the quiet of the house, the kind of quiet that had once felt oppressive, but now felt different. It wasn't loneliness that settled in. It was something deeper, something more complicated. I started thinking about the days before the years when I had been so wrapped up in her life that I lost track of my own. I thought about how much I had changed, how much I had learned. I realized that while my role as her mother would always be a part of who I was, it no longer defined me. As the hours passed, I found myself walking through the house, taking in the familiar surroundings. The house felt the same, but I was different, and I was learning to embrace that difference, to step into the future without the weight of who I thought I was supposed to be. I didn't need to be perfect anymore. I didn't need to be the mother I had once imagined, the one who never made mistakes, who always knew what was best. I didn't need to have it all together. I just needed to be real. And in that, I found freedom. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table, reflecting on everything, the journey I had taken, the lessons I had learned, and the peace I had found. It wasn't the ending I had expected, but it was one I could accept. I opened my notebook, something I hadn't done in weeks, and began to write not just about the past, but about the future, about what I wanted for myself, for my own growth. I realized I didn't have to be anything for anyone but myself. I didn't have to fill the silence with noise. I could just be. The world was wide open, and for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of it. I didn't know where this new journey would take me, but I knew one thing for sure. I was ready. Ready to live, ready to grow, and ready to finally let go of the version of myself that had been defined by motherhood alone. I was ready to be more than that. The next few months were filled with discovery. I enrolled in classes not because I felt I had to, but because I wanted to. I began traveling, something I had dreamed of for years, but never made time for. I found hobbies I hadn't pursued in years, and I embraced the quiet moments, those small, simple pleasures that made life feel full again. And as I began to rediscover the woman I had put aside for so long, I couldn't help but think of Isabel. I thought of her not as the little girl who had needed me every step of the way, but as the young woman she was becoming. She was finding herself, carving her own path, and so was I. One evening, after a long day of classes, I sat down to dinner alone. The house was quieter than usual, but the stillness didn't feel empty anymore. It felt peaceful. I thought about Isabel, about the distance that had grown between us, but also the closeness that had emerged. I thought about how she was out there living her own life, and how proud I was of the person she had become. It wasn't easy. The process of letting go, of accepting that she no longer needed me in the same way, was harder than I had ever imagined. But in letting go, I had found my own sense of purpose, my own place in this world. I had become the woman I was always meant to be, imperfect, real, and free. And as I sat there, the quiet of the evening wrapping around me like a warm embrace, I knew I had done something important. I had survived the hardest part of all, letting go and finding myself again. The months after Isabel's departure brought a strange sense of liberation, though not without its bittersweet moments. There were still days when the house felt too empty, too quiet. Days when I would find myself reaching for my phone to call her, only to remember that she was no longer just a few rooms away, no longer waiting for me to fix her problems or offer her advice on everything under the sun. She was out there, living her life, learning to be her own person. And in that realization, I felt both pride and a little sadness, the kind of sadness that comes from knowing that this is what she needed, what she deserved. But it wasn't just sadness. There was something else too, something deeper. It was a sense of peace, a peace I hadn't fully understood before. The quiet of the house didn't suffocate me anymore. It allowed me to breathe, to think, to finally see what had been right in front of me all along, myself. I took long walks in the evenings, letting the cool air fill my lungs as I walked down familiar streets. I watched the seasons change, the way the trees bloomed in spring and shed their leaves in fall, and I thought about the changes that were happening in my own life. They were subtle, like the changing of the seasons, but they were real. I had learned to embrace the quiet, to enjoy my own company, without feeling the need to fill every moment with distraction. I spent my evenings reading books I had never gotten around to before, or journaling about the things I had been too busy to consider when my life was entirely centered around Isabel. There were mornings when I would wake up without the pressing urgency of making breakfast or driving her to school, and I would take the time to sit and reflect. I began to make more space for my own dreams, the ones I had buried in the past, the ones that had once seemed too selfish to pursue. I enrolled in a painting class, something I had always wanted to do. And while I wasn't an artist by any stretch of the imagination, the process of creating something from scratch, of allowing myself to experiment and make mistakes, felt like reclaiming a part of me that had been lost. It wasn't about creating a perfect masterpiece. It was about allowing myself the freedom to fail, to try, and to find beauty in imperfection. And in doing that, I realized that I had been chasing perfection for so long that I had never stopped to appreciate the messiness of life. The beauty was in the process, not the product. One afternoon, as I was cleaning out some old boxes in the attic, I came across a few mementos from the years when Isabel was little old-school projects, photographs, little trinkets she had made for me. I sat down in the dusty light, the smell of old paper filling the air, and I went through each item remembering who she was then and who she had become. I smiled as I looked at the pictures, at the little versions of herself she had once been. I had spent so many years holding on to the idea of her as a child, as the little girl who needed me, that I had forgotten to let her grow. But now, as I sat there, I understood that the child she had been wasn't gone. She was simply evolving, just like I was. And in her evolution, I had learned to evolve too. I didn't need to be the mother I once imagined. I didn't need to be perfect. I just needed to be there to support her as she grew, just as I was learning to grow. And in that realization, I finally felt at peace. The next time I spoke to Isabel, a few weeks after she had settled into her new life, I could hear the change in her voice. There was a confidence there now, a steadiness that hadn't been there before. She talked about her classes, her new friends, the small victories she had achieved since arriving at school. And as I listened, I realized that she wasn't just telling me about her life. She was sharing it with me. She wasn't waiting for me to offer solutions or advice. She was living her life, and she wanted me to see it. "I'm really happy here, Mom," she said one evening, her voice warm and full of excitement. "I think I'm starting to figure out who I am." I could hear the smile in her voice, and it made me smile too. "I'm proud of you," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "I'm proud of the person you're becoming." We spoke for a little while longer, catching up on the little things, but I could tell she was already getting used to her independence, to the idea that she could live her life without me constantly hovering. And though part of me wanted to hold on to remind her that I was still here, still ready to step in whenever she needed me, I realized that this was what we both needed. We needed space. We needed time to grow together, yet apart. The days turned into weeks and the weeks into months. Isabel continued to grow into herself, and I continued to find my way as well. There were days when I missed her more than I could put into words, days when I wished I could reach out and wrap her in my arms, but I knew that I was doing what I needed to do for both of us. And so I kept walking down the quiet paths of my own life, allowing myself to change, to be imperfect, to make mistakes. And in that, I realized that the process of letting go was never really about losing anything. It was about making room for both of us, to find our own way room, for both of us to grow, to live our lives in the way we were meant to. It wasn't easy. It wasn't always graceful, but it was real. And in the end, I knew that was enough, because in letting go, we'd found each other again, not as who we had been, but as who we were becoming. And that was the greatest gift of all. As I settled into this new rhythm of life, I started to realize just how much the small moments mattered. It wasn't about the big, life-changing events anymore. It was about the quiet days, the ones that seemed to pass by unnoticed. Those moments were where I found my peace, in the simplicity of a cup of coffee, in the warmth of a blanket on a cold morning, in the unspoken understanding that I was enough just as I was. It had been months since Isabel left for college, and I found myself reflecting on how much had changed. I was still learning to live for myself, still finding new pieces of me that I had set aside for so long. And in that process, I began to understand something deeper that I had spent so many years thinking that my worth was tied to my role as a mother, but that wasn't the whole of me. I was more than just the person who cared for others. I was a woman in my own right with dreams and passions and desires that didn't need to be justified by anyone else's expectations. I was allowed to take up space. I was allowed to be imperfect. And in that acceptance, I began to find a quiet strength I hadn't known I possessed. One evening after dinner, I found myself sitting outside staring at the stars. The night was calm, the air cool, but not uncomfortable, and there was something about the stillness that felt comforting. I hadn't realized how much I had missed this, the peace of being alone, but not lonely, the solitude of having time to just think, to breathe. I thought about Isabel, about the conversations we'd had in the past few months. She had grown so much since leaving home, and while part of me missed the girl she once was, another part of me was proud of the young woman she was becoming. She was finding her way just as I was finding mine. In a way, we were both embarking on a new journey, a journey of rediscovery, of letting go of old expectations and embracing the unknown. And though the path ahead was uncertain for both of us, it didn't feel like something to be afraid of anymore. It felt like something to be embraced. The phone buzzed in my pocket, interrupting my thoughts, and I pulled it out to find a message from Isabel. "Hey, Mom, just wanted to let you know I'm doing well. I'm taking this photography class, and I'm really starting to enjoy it. I think I found something I really love." A wave of warmth washed over me as I read her message. There was something about the simplicity of it, the way she was beginning to carve out her own space in the world, something that was entirely hers. And it made me realize just how far we had both come. We weren't just surviving anymore. We were living. We were learning how to navigate the world in a way that was true to ourselves. I replied with a simple, heartfelt message. I'm so proud of you. You're doing great. It was all I needed to say. The words didn't have to be grand. They didn't have to be full of advice or direction. They were just an acknowledgement of the journey we were both on. And I realized that in a way, we were more connected than ever, not through the roles we played, but through the shared experience of living. As I sat there staring at the stars again, I felt the weight of everything I had been carrying for so long begin to lift. The fear of not being enough, the fear of losing my identity, the fear of the future, it was all beginning to fade. The truth was simple. I was enough. I had always been enough. And as I continued to live, I was learning to accept myself, flaws and all. Isabel wasn't the only one discovering who she was meant to be. I was discovering it too. The days continued to pass in their quiet, steady rhythm. I worked, I wrote, I spent time with friends, and I continued to explore the parts of myself I had long neglected. I joined a local art group, started volunteering at a shelter, and even took a spontaneous trip to a nearby town just for the sake of adventure. I wasn't waiting for anything to change anymore. I wasn't waiting for the next chapter or the next big event. I was living in the here and now, accepting the present for what it was and finding joy in the small things. There were still hard days, days when the quiet was overwhelming, when I missed the chaos of the past. But those days were becoming fewer, and with each passing day, I learned a little more about myself, the woman I had been, the woman I was, and the woman I was becoming. And then one afternoon, the phone rang. It was Isabel. I hadn't heard from her in a while, and I immediately felt a rush of excitement mixed with a tinge of nervousness. Mom. Her voice was excited, bright with enthusiasm. I've been accepted to study abroad next semester. I know it's a big step, but I think it's something I have to do. I want to see the world, experience new things. I'm scared, but I think it's time. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt a surge of pride mixed with the bittersweet realization that she was growing into the person she was always meant to be. This was her moment, her choice. And though part of me wanted to hold her back to keep her close, I knew this was exactly what she needed. I think that's amazing, I said, my voice steady, but full of emotion. I'm so proud of you, and I know you'll make the most of it. I couldn't have done this without you, Mom, she replied softly. You've always shown me how to be brave, how to take chances. I think I finally understand what you were trying to teach me. I swallowed hard, not trusting my voice for a moment. You've always been brave, sweetheart. You're just starting to see it for yourself. We talked for a little longer, and as the conversation ended, I felt a deep sense of peace wash over me. Isabel was stepping into her life fully, with confidence and excitement. And I was doing the same. As I hung up the phone and sat back in my chair, I realized that this was the true essence of motherhood, not about holding on, but about letting go. Not about shaping someone else's journey, but about empowering them to find their own way. And in letting her go, I had finally found my way too. I had found my peace, my freedom, and my strength. This wasn't the ending I had expected, but it was the one I had always needed, and it was perfect in its own way. As the months continued to pass, life began to feel almost serene, a quiet sort of peace settling over me that I hadn't even realized I'd been craving. Isabel's departure for her study abroad trip was a new chapter for both of us. Her finding herself in a different part of the world, and me finally embracing the solitude that I had long feared. The strange thing was, I didn't feel empty. I felt full in a way that was so unexpected, it took me a while to understand. It wasn't about filling the space she had left behind. It was about realizing that I was whole on my own. Isabel had returned home for a short visit after her semester abroad, and the moment she stepped into the house, I could feel the change in both of us. She was different, more confident, more grounded. She had stepped into the world on her own terms, and I could see that in her eyes, in the way she held herself. She wasn't the same girl I had sent off, and that was both exhilarating and bittersweet. She'd always been the center of my world, but now I could feel her taking her own place in it, not just as my daughter, but as an individual. And somehow I found a similar strength within myself. No longer was I simply her mother, a role I had wrapped my entire identity around. I was a woman with my own dreams, my own path, my own story. We spent those few days together in a way that felt like an easy continuation of the bond we had always shared, but it was different, more relaxed, more open. There was no tension anymore, no more need to fix things that weren't broken. We were both figuring it out in our own ways. One evening, we were sitting together on the porch, watching the sun set behind the trees. The air was cool, the soft kind of cool that made everything feel calm. We were both quiet for a long time, just listening to the evening sounds of crickets and the rustling of leaves in the wind. Then Isabel turned to me, her expression serious. "Mom," she said, her voice soft. "I think I've finally figured something out." I turned to her, raising an eyebrow, silently urging her to continue. "I think I've spent so much of my life worrying about being perfect," she said slowly, "about trying to fit into someone else's mold of what I was supposed to be. But I'm starting to realize that the only person I need to be is me. I think I finally understand that it's okay not to have everything figured out, to just take things as they come." My heart swelled in my chest, a mixture of pride and relief washing over me. I had watched her grow into a young woman with such grace, such strength. She wasn't just finding herself. She was embracing her imperfections, her contradictions, and making peace with them. "I'm so proud of you," I said, my voice a little shaky. "I'm proud of the woman you've become. You're not just my daughter anymore. You're someone who has her own path, her own life. And that's everything I ever wanted for you." She smiled a little smile that reached her eyes. "I know, Mom. I finally get it. And I think I'm ready to see where my path leads." We didn't say much after that. Words felt unnecessary. But in that quiet moment, in the shared silence between us, I realized that we had come full circle. She was her own person now, and I was my own person. Our lives were our own, and while we would always be connected, we were both free to live them fully. That night, as I lay in bed, I found myself reflecting on everything. The years I had spent raising Isabel, the sacrifices I had made, the quiet victories, and the moments of doubt. I thought about the person I had been before she was born, the woman who had dreams and ambitions outside of motherhood. I thought about the years I had spent forgetting who I was, consumed by the role of mother, and I thought about how in the end I had rediscovered myself. Motherhood had been an immense part of my life, and it would always be a part of who I was. But it wasn't all that I was. I had allowed myself to become a mother at the cost of my own identity, and for a long time, I couldn't see who I was outside of that. But in letting go, in allowing Isabel to live her life fully and independently, I had found a piece of myself again. And that was the greatest gift of all. I didn't need to hold on to the past anymore. I didn't need to keep trying to be the perfect mother, the perfect person. I just needed to be me. And that was enough. The journey wasn't about finding a destination. It wasn't about fixing anything. It was about learning to accept the messy, beautiful truth of who I was and allowing myself the grace to change, to grow, and to live without the need to prove anything. As the days stretched on and Isabel prepared to return to school, I knew that the path ahead would not be without its challenges. There would be moments of doubt, moments where I would feel like I was losing my way again. But I also knew that I had the strength to face whatever came next, because I had already learned the most important lesson of all: I am enough. Isabel was starting her own journey, and I was starting mine. We were no longer defined by roles, by expectations, or by who we were supposed to be. We were simply who we were, imperfect, real, and free. And that finally was enough. As I sit here now, I realize that the journey I've been on wasn't about fixing anything, wasn't about trying to put together the pieces of a broken past. It was about letting go of expectations, letting go of perfection, letting go of the woman I thought I had to be enough. In the quiet of my home, in the space that Isabel has left behind, I found something I didn't even realize I was searching for: peace. Not just in the silence, but in the understanding that I am enough, just as I am. The woman who gave everything for her child, the woman who lost herself for years, is finally standing on her own 2 feet again, not needing validation or approval, but simply existing as herself. Some treasures had been recovered. Others, more valuable, still had been discovered for the first time. It wasn't the ending I'd expected. It was better, harder, clearer, more honest. It was mine. And as for Isabel, she's found her own path, just as I have. And though she's miles away living her life, I know that we'll always be connected. Not by what we once were, but by who we've become: 2 people who have learned to live fully, imperfectly, and with grace. This is my life now, imperfect, uncertain, but full of promise, and I'm ready for whatever comes next. Thanks for listening. If this story has resonated with you, share your voice in the comments. You matter, your story matters. Don't forget to subscribe. Your journey is just as important as mine.